As spring 1945 dawned, Berlin stood as the last bastion of Nazi Germany. The city, once a symbol of power, now lay in ruins, its streets scarred by relentless Allied bombings. Inside the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler and his inner circle clung to delusions of victory, even as the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east. The civilian population, already weary from years of war, faced an uncertain future. Families huddled in basements, rationing meager supplies, and bracing for the inevitable onslaught. The air was thick with fear and resignation. For many, the question was no longer if the city would fall, but when. As Soviet forces closed in, the residents of Berlin prepared for the final chapter of a war that had consumed their lives. On April 16, 1945, the Soviet offensive began in earnest at Seelow Heights, just east of Berlin. The German defenders, numbering around 100,000, were entrenched in fortified positions, determined to halt the Soviet advance. The battle was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Soviet forces, numbering over 1 million, pressed forward relentlessly. For civilians in nearby villages, the sounds of battle were harrowing. Many sought refuge in underground shelters, praying for the safety of their loved ones. As the days wore on, the relentless artillery bombardments and the advancing Soviet troops pushed the German defenders back. By April 19th, the Soviets had broken through, paving the way for the final assault on Berlin. The civilian population, though not directly involved in the fighting, bore witness to the horrors of war and the impending collapse of the Nazi regime. By April 21st, Soviet forces had completed the encirclement of Berlin. The city was isolated, with no escape routes for its inhabitants. Inside, panic and confusion reigned. Families were separated as they attempted to flee or find shelter. The streets, once bustling with life, were now eerily silent, save for the distant sounds of artillery fire. Food and water supplies dwindled, and the threat of disease loomed large. Civilians took refuge in basements and bunkers, hoping to survive the onslaught. The German defenders, already stretched thin, struggled to maintain order. The once proud capital of the Third Reich had become a city under siege, its fate sealed by the advancing Soviet forces. From April 21st to April 30th, 1945, Berlin transformed into a city of fire, smoke, and utter devastation. The Soviet Red Army launched relentless assaults on every district, engaging in brutal house-to-house combat. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, their streets littered with debris and corpses. Tanks crushed barricades, artillery shells tore through buildings, and gunfire echoed incessantly through shattered corridors. The German defenders, a desperate mix of regular army troops, Hitler Youth boys barely in their teens, and Volkssturm units armed with rifles and improvised explosives, fought tenaciously, but their resistance was increasingly futile. Amid the chaos, civilians endured unimaginable suffering. Families huddled in basements, rationing scraps of food, and shielding children from the deafening blasts above. Smoke and dust choked the air, making breathing a struggle, while the constant fear of death gripped every heart. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, many receiving minimal care due to destroyed infrastructure and shortages of medicine. Water was scarce, and disease spread quickly in the overcrowded shelters. Every trip outside carried the risk of instant death from stray bullets, collapsing buildings, or sudden artillery strikes. The emotional toll on Berlin's population was immense. Parents clutched their children, praying silently as the world above them crumbled. Elderly residents, too weak to move, faced the constant threat of death in their homes. Even simple acts, like fetching water or food, became life-threatening ventures. The city, once vibrant and bustling, had become a prison of fear, where survival was measured in hours rather than days. Every explosion, every scream, reminded civilians of the fragility of life. By the end of the week, Berlin was not merely a battlefield, it was a city engulfed in despair, fire, and the human cost of war, a place where hope persisted only in the hearts of those determined to survive. Deep within the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler faced the collapse of his regime. As Soviet forces closed in on the city, The atmosphere was one of despair and disbelief. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler and his wife, Eva Braun, took their own lives, marking the symbolic end of Nazi Germany. Outside the bunker, Berliners continued to endure the horrors of war. The streets were filled with the sounds of battle, and the city was shrouded in smoke and dust. Civilians, already traumatized by weeks of fighting, now faced the uncertainty of a post-Nazi world. The emotional impact of Hitler's death was mixed. For some, it was a moment of relief, while for others, it marked the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. On May 1st, 1945, Soviet troops captured the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of Nazi power. The raising of the red flag over the building marked the end of the battle and the fall of Berlin. For the civilian population, the event was met with a mixture of emotions. Some celebrated the end of the Nazi regime, while others mourned the destruction of their city. The streets, once filled with the sounds of battle, were now eerily quiet. The city lay in ruins, and the survivors faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives. The fall of the Reichstag was not just a military victory, it was a turning point in history, signaling the end of World War II in Europe. On May 2nd, 1945, the remaining German forces in Berlin surrendered to the Soviet Red Army. The city, though still smouldering from the recent battles, was now under Soviet control. For the civilian population, the surrender brought a sense of relief, but also uncertainty. The city was in ruins, and the future was unclear. Many residents were left homeless, and basic necessities were scarce. The emotional toll of the battle was evident in the faces of the survivors. The war had taken everything from them, and now they faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives in a city that had been reduced to rubble. The Battle of Berlin was one of the most devastating urban confrontations in history. The Soviet Red Army suffered approximately 81,116 soldiers killed or missing, with an additional 280,251 wounded or sick during the operation. German military casualties are estimated between 92,000 and 100,000 killed, with over 200,000 wounded. Civilian losses were catastrophic, with approximately 125,000 civilians perishing during the battle. Beyond the immediate fatalities, over 1 million people were left homeless, and the city was in ruins. Starvation became rampant, with the average Berliner receiving only 64% of a daily ration by June 1945. Disease spread through the overcrowded shelters, and the psychological trauma endured by survivors was profound. The emotional toll of the battle left deep scars on the city's population, many of whom had lost loved ones, homes, and a sense of normalcy. Victory in Europe was officially celebrated on May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally. The fall of Berlin sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The battle is remembered as a story of both courage and suffering. Soldiers fought heroically, civilians endured unimaginable hardships, and the city itself was forever changed. Today Berlin stands rebuilt, yet the scars of 1945 linger in memory and monuments. The Battle of Berlin remains a stark reminder of human resilience, the horrors of war, and the emotional cost borne by countless innocent lives. It is a story of destruction, survival, and the enduring spirit of those who lived through history's darkest hours.